Now we're good.
Good morning, everybody. It is the Civil Disobedience Tour from the Lethbridge Historical Society. It is 10:30 and we're going to get going. My name, of course, is Belinda Crowson. I'm the president of the Lethbridge Historical Society. With me are Genesis behind the camera and Nicole, and we will be taking on a tour. Now, it is October. You know October in southern Alberta. The wind is out and it is making some noise. So I'm going to either try to hide behind buildings so you can hear me well, or I will try to be loud. So if you have problems with the sound, do let me know. We will try to adjust as we go through. This is our last tour of the scheduled tours for 2021. So I want you to think about it. Usually about January, February, we start planning what our tours will be. We don't know next year if they will be virtual or live, but we'll start planning the ideas, start doing the research. So if you have a topic you don't think we've covered yet, a neighborhood you'd like to learn more about, either today or at some point, get that information to us at the Lethbridge Historical Society. Like I said, you want to get it in by January or February because we need months to do the research, months to organize the tours. These don't just happen at the drop of a hat. This is live. This will be on our page, but remember, like all of our tours, we will also be putting it on the Historical Society YouTube page so you can watch it whenever you'd like as well. If you are a Lethbridge Historical Society member, so you are a paid-up member in the Society, please make sure to make some comments at the end of all the tours, and this being the last, we will do draws for gift cards for a couple of our members for coming out along. I don't think it'll come as a surprise to anyone that over the last few years, there have been numerous protests and demonstrations here in Lethbridge around the world. And this made me start wondering and thinking. We see all these demonstrations today. We see the different issues that people protest about. Did they occur throughout Lethbridge history? And yes, of course they did. And what were they about? What issues and concerns in the past brought Lethbridge people out to the street, made them protest, demonstrate, riot on some occasions? What were their opinions about? How did they express it? So that is the purpose of today's tour, is to look at some of the civil disobedience, some of the protests, marches, and issues of Lethbridge history. We will not be covering them all, so if I miss some of your favorites, you can let me know, and we can always include it on another tour. But this is some of the ones that, some of the big ones, some that you may not know of, and also some that kind of fit in with our walk today. We had to start here. We're standing actually at the corner of 2nd Avenue and 4th Street South. Around the corner you will see the buildings of Chinatown. We're standing here right on the northwest corner of that intersection. And the reason I chose to start here is we are standing in Red Square. This is where in the 1930s you would have seen things around the communists in Lethbridge, around the labor groups in Lethbridge, and more. And many events were held here. We actually have phenomenal pictures of people standing on the roof of the Chinese National League building and actually addressing a large crowd in this area. So we know various events occurred here. Rallies were held almost every May 1st on International Workers' Day here, but also throughout the year. And if you would have read the newspaper, you would hear some every so often read, "Come to Red Square." To give you some examples of things that were happening here, in June 1934, the Central Relief Committee decided that Lethbridge's unemployed should go on strike. Now you might wonder, how would the unemployed go on strike? They were receiving relief or welfare from the city, and other cities had done this as well. They had gone on strike to try to increase the amount of relief that the city was paying and to actually get better benefits for those who are on welfare. They decided, as I said, to have a relief strike that other communities had done either in the previous year or were also doing that year. A mass meeting was held here. Again, the speakers would have been on the roof of the old Chinese National League building on the 6th of June, 1934. During that mass meeting, attendees learned that Edmonton had gained a 25% boost in their relief schedules by having a similar strike, and that Calgary's unemployed had won their relief strike the year prior in 1933. As well, Lethbridge was going along with Drumheller, who were currently in the middle of a single strike. It was noted at that time that approximately 70% of those on relief, so those unemployed in Lethbridge, were behind and supporting the strike. Recognizing it was the only avenue still open to them to have their needs met at that time. So on the 10th of June, 1934, 300 people attended a call to arms to actually start to plan the strike. They noted that their goal was to gain the sympathy of the small storekeepers and the regular taxpayers of Lethbridge. They needed to have adequate support for them and to make sure that the homeless in Lethbridge were taken care of. Organizers stated that the government should pay for it by taxing big companies more. One of the things you'll realize as we go through this, some of the same issues people protested in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s are still part of the protest today. Now, as they were planning their strike, they decided not to use violence, but to protest and demonstrate peacefully. And on the 15th of June, 1934, the strike began. During the write-up on this, it was noted that at every one of these meetings, the police came out in force and were actually attending the unemployed meeting to see what was happening. Some of the leaders of the strike claimed to have been threatened by the police during this time. During the strike, it came to the awareness of the strike organizers that ununionized scab labor was being used at one of the factories in Lethbridge, and that way they could keep people working and not have to pay attention to the strike. 90 striking men and women gathered at the factory. The police drew out their batons as the crowd approached the factory. So very soon the two groups were facing off, but the strike organizers, who had made a decision to do this in a non-violent way, called off the strike protest there, and the incident ended without any fighting. This strike only lasted a week. It ended when the coal miners withdrew their support from it. The strike organizers met with the city following the strike and requested that no discrimination be shown to those who had striked, and then worked with the city to ensure that all the names of all the strikers were put back on the relief list so that they and their families could once again get welfare. Over that decade, though, those leading this cause often faced jail time and legal battles. George Anderson, who was a prime mover in that strike, was jailed for a year for using seditious language. James Sloan, another leader, also had run-ins with the law. He was also one of the ones years earlier that was behind the Estevan strike. This is but one story of a strike that occurred after being planned here in Red Square. We also know around the same time, winter of 1933-1935, there was a series of rallies of the Farmers Unity League. This was the agricultural aspect of the Communist Party of Canada. They did rallies here in town, but also went out and met with groups of beet workers throughout the entire beet area and helped to form a union among the beet workers of the area. So a lot of different things that were occurring in this area were often happening here from Red Square. Now, before we move from here, I just want to share one story of this place before it was Red Square, before it was Chinatown. This is an event likely from the 1890s and was said to have occurred around 1st and 2nd Avenues in what they called in the 1890s the foreign settlement. So this would have been referring primarily to Eastern European miners in this area. Acting Sheriff W.D. Whitney came to this area back in the 1890s to make an arrest. Whitney came across resistance, and others in the community came to help, both on Whitney's side and on the side of the person he was trying to arrest. This is a direct quote from the newspaper. It happened on the evening of a Sunday when services were in progress in the churches, and needless to state, they were hurriedly emptied. Reverend Mr. McKillop dismissed his entire congregation without much ceremony, and was the first of the citizens to arrive on the scene and take a hand to help the handful of police until reinforcements arrived from the barracks, when Inspector White Fraser read the riot act before he broke down the door and with Corporal Charles Ross entered the house. Somewhere about 100 were placed under arrest and taken to the Northwest Mounted Police Barracks pending trial. So you can imagine if the church is all emptied and there is 100 people arrested, quite an event took place here in the 1890s. That's the only information I have on that event. Still trying to find more research, but certainly this area here around 2nd Avenue, 4th Street, 1st Avenue, 3rd Street had a lot of early civil disobedience action on it. But we're now going to move a little bit further east on 2nd Avenue over to the Hungarian Hall. As we walk, again, if you have questions or comments, please make them. We'll take the opportunity to read them as we're going, but we'll go hide behind another building for the next couple of stories. This is where we get the wind now. maybe they're holding the gates open. That would make sense. All right, we'll hide here. All right, we're hiding now in the alley right behind Hungarian Hall on 2nd Avenue South. Hopefully if we hide here, we will be able to not hear as much of the wind and you can hear me. This one is a reference to the 1960 street brawl that occurred here on 2nd Avenue South. Many of you might actually remember this one or have heard of this one. During a wedding here at the Hungarian Hall in November 1960, police were called about a fight taking place on the sidewalk right outside the hall. When the police arrived, the fight was over. However, they noticed several people were drinking here on the sidewalk outside the hall. So the police decided to arrest people that were outside drinking. Now, one of the things the newspaper at the time discussed is that many of the people who were here at the wedding had come from Hungary just prior, following the Hungarian rebellion there, and were used to more laid-back European drinking laws. So thought absolutely nothing about taking their drinks outside the hall to drink, but of course that was not permitted under the Canadian law. And so when the police and the wedding attendees met, the police were met with resistance and a fight broke out between the police and the wedding attendees. Bricks were thrown, knives were used, a police car was severely damaged. The fight only ended when the fire department, which of course is next door at that time to the Hungarian Hall, actually got involved. They brought out their fire hoses, soaked down all the people fighting, and ended the fight. The police also took time in the newspaper following the fight to thank all of the Indigenous people in downtown Lethbridge who actually came over and assisted the police in winning that fight as well. 12 men and 1 woman were arrested following the brawl. They were charged with riotously disturbing the peace and unlawful assembly and riot. So another event here on 2nd Avenue South. Now we won't make it all the way down, but if you can imagine going further east here, if we kept going down on 2nd Avenue, we would get down to 12th Street, 12A, 12B, and where the old arena used to be located. At the old arena in 1944, there was also another near riot. This one had nothing to do with a wedding. That one was all about politics. In July 1944, approximately 1,000 people were filling the Lethbridge Arena for a CCF, Cooperative Commonwealth Federation, rally. They were there to hear M.J. Coldwell, the federal CCF leader, and Elmer Roper, the provincial CCF leader. In the middle of the event, J.C. Landrieu, who was a local social credit candidate, got up in the middle of 1,000 CCF members and called Caldwell a liar. As you can imagine, that was not taken well by the crowd. The CCF ushers who were working the event moved to grab Landrieu and his supporters and rushed them out of the building. Fists were flown. Landrieu ended up bleeding from the mouth by the time they got him out to the lobby. Now Coldwell and Roper, as they were speaking at the time, managed to restore order in the arena. Landrieu was escorted out and the rally continued at the arena. So we do have occasional political fights. I know some of you read the one I had a few days ago on there about twice R.B. Bennett, future Prime Minister of Canada, was burned in effigy in Cardston. So we certainly have and do continue to take our politics quite seriously. We haven't seen a riot like that though in a few years. We're going to go around the corner to the front of the Lethbridge Hotel and talk about tar and feathering in Lethbridge history. Don't do it.
When we do in-person tours, we could do it with our camera and post them afterwards.
Yes. The old brick is being so good. Nice bad building, but cool for photographs. And how you get those little twists or something. Let's kind of stand here so we can see we're in front of left, but not on the corner.
Yeah.
any of you who've walked in downtown Lethbridge know the corners always seem to get the wind the worst, so we've moved in a little bit here at Lethbridge Hotel. So I am now standing in front of Lethbridge Hotel. This building has so many incredible stories attached to it. The buildings have been here, of course, since the 1880s, though we're on a different building today. But at this site in 1895, we are involved with a tar and feathering event. In February 1895, Charles Gillis committed suicide. He was actually living further south here on 5th Street, and he sat in his home and shot himself in the head. Following his death, an inquest was held, and the inquest stated that he had committed suicide while laboring under mental depression caused by domestic troubles. Gillis was a driver for the coal mines. In the 1890s, we're in a recession. He had only worked 2 days in the last month, was out of money, and the stores were beginning to refuse him credit. He was also having marital problems. The day before his suicide, his wife had threatened to take their 2 children and move back east to her family. That is what the inquest said had caused the suicide. But the people of Lethbridge saw it quite differently. They saw that it had a lot more to do with a man named James Donaldson. When times started to be difficult financially for the family, they had taken in a lodger, James Donaldson. On more than one occasion, Gillis had complained to his friends of the undue intimacy between Donaldson and his wife. So people had this understanding that Gillis was not happy with that relationship between Donaldson and Mrs. Gillis. And to make matters worse, at Gillis's funeral, James Donaldson acted as the chief mourner. So the people of Lethbridge decided to take matters into their own hands. 2 nights after the suicide, a group of armed, masked men broke into the home where Max Donaldson, James Donaldson's brother, was staying, and where James was living at the time. Donaldson was pulled from his bed, tarred and feathered, and this is not like you see in the movies. This is having hot tar poured over your body, and then feathers. And the only way you can remove that tar afterwards is by removing skin. He was then led with a rope around his neck to the Lethbridge Hotel, where he was left. His brother Max was kept in the house by 2 men with guns. Half an hour later, they let him go, and he was able to run to the police station. At the time of the event, neither brother could identify anyone in the group. Remember, they were masked. James Donaldson chose to leave town, but things started to happen a little while later. It came to the attention of Superintendent Dean, who was the head of the mounted police here in Lethbridge at that time, that one of his own men was involved in this attack. Sergeant Hare had actually been seen the night of the tar and feathering, actually with a gun, with feathers, and with a black mask. As well, as luck would have it, Max Donaldson finally came to recognize one of the voices. In order to make sure that nobody was ever caught, when the men once, with their masks on, they actually brought an American with them, a man named Charles Warren, who had just recently moved to town. And they had him do all the talking in the hopes that his voice wouldn't be recognized. But eventually Donaldson was able to say, yes, Warren is the voice I heard. So with all that information, Hare turned Queen's evidence, and Charles Warren was arrested and charged with burglary and riot. The case went to court. The first jury could not agree on the case, so a new trial was ordered. Before the second trial could occur, Hare decided that leaving Southern Alberta was a smart idea. In fact, he was paid to leave Southern Alberta. He was given some money and a ride across the Montana border. With him gone, there wasn't enough evidence against Warren. Warren was released on bail and skipped the country, heading to Montana as well. No one was ever convicted of the tar and feathering. In fact, many people in the community felt that poetic justice had been served. One of the church ministers in Lethbridge at that time noted that Donaldson had committed a moral offense and that he, the minister, could not regret what had happened. So when even the church ministers were okay with it, you can see why nobody was ever finally convicted of the tar and feathering. Yep. All right. We're going to move down a little more just to get out of the wind, and then we're going to turn our attention to Gulf Gardens across. I'm going to stand on the edge of the creek. Do you want to just look this way? I think we're further away from the rain.
Yeah.
Now, when you look at protests and demonstrations in Lethbridge, it has been all ages that have been part of protests. Even children protested in Lethbridge history. In April 1947, the price of chocolate bars in Canada increased from 5 cents to 8 cents. That's almost a doubling of the price of chocolate bars. And this upset many children across the country. So up until the Second World War, chocolate bars cost 5 cents. But during the war, the Canadian government imposed a 1 cent war tax on chocolate bars. This was a tax to help to pay for the war. Children expected that the price would return to 5 cents following the war. After all, they, like everyone else, had done their public service during the war, they had given things up, and they really thought after the war they'd get their 5-cent chocolate bar back. So in the spring of 1947, when the price of chocolate bars dramatically raised from 5 cents to 8 cents, children across Canada were upset. And very quickly you actually see protests, boycotts, and parades across Canada done by kids. Here in Lethbridge, the children also got involved. Grade 8 girls at the Westminster School organized a protest parade in April of 1947. They made signs, they organized all the other grades, and they marched from Westminster School, which was then at 5th Avenue and 13th Street North, up to the subway, and then turned around and went back down 13th Street North back to the school. We actually have pictures of this protest. Some of the signs say, "We're not millionaires," "Down with 8-cent chocolate bars," "This isn't fair," etc. The kids were very upset. After seeing what Westminster School, that following Saturday on May 1st, there was actually a much larger protest held downtown Lethbridge, where kids from across the community protested. And across Canada, kids are out working and protesting. Very quickly, though, there is pushback against the protest. It was claimed that the entire thing, all the kids across Canada, were being directed by the National Federation of Labour Youth, who were connected with the Communist Party of Canada. As soon as the threat of communism was raised, parents across the country shut down the protests, and chocolate bars remained 8 cents. So unfortunately, the kids did not get their chocolate bar back. Another protest that happened here in Gulf Gardens was in 1968. On the day of the first University of Lethbridge convocation, held in May 1968. The convocation was held at Southminster Church. Of course, the convocation occurs, but that day also became a day of protest. Where to build the university was a huge debate in Lethbridge. At the time, in 1968, the university was still operating at a temporary location by the college. And there were people who wanted the university to be built near the college. There were other business people who wanted the university built on the north side. And then there were some who wanted it on the west side. In the end, the province would have the final decision. And there was all sorts of debate about where it should be. Well, as I said, the university was pushing for a west side campus. After the convocation at Southminster, there was a protest march here to Gulf Gardens, and then speeches were held here in the park. More than 500 people participated in the march. That was the formal protest. There was also an informal protest following the march. A group of students went to MLA Landrieu's house to have a second protest there. When they got there, they were met by the police. Opposition was occurring between the two groups. Fortunately, the police chief arrived, tempers were calmed down, and nothing too serious happened at the second informal protest. All right, we're going to go up to the corner and talk about the Zoot Suit riot of the 1940s. Nobody was wearing zoot suits and nobody rioted, but that's the name we have it by. So we'll have to figure out how to get across 3rd Avenue safely. What is this tripping hazard on this? It's styrofoam, but don't trip.
No,
That probably came in with the wind as well.
I think so too. It's surprisingly hot.
I know. It's supposed to be 23, 25 this afternoon.
Wow.
I don't know what anybody else is doing, but I still have my potatoes in the ground, and I got to get those out eventually.
Yeah. I have carrots in there too.
Carrots are good to leave till after the first frost. If they get a little sweeter, I mean, you can take them down.
Yeah.
So I think I'm going to leave my carrots, but we'll see. Okay, this is easier to get across than the last tour.
Yeah.
We're going to be going up to the border. That's going to give us a week there. We have a ways to go.
No comments yet.
No.
Super quiet.
It's a quiet group out there this morning.
Yeah.
Maybe all the commenters are at church. It could be way worse. All right. We'll go right in front of Cobanks because we can do 3 stories from that location.
Okay.
First, we'll look across at the other building. So I said we would talk about the Zoot Suit riot, even though nobody was wearing a Zoot Suit and it wasn't a riot. The name comes from the 1940s. During the Second World War, there were some people pushing back against the war across North America. And one of the things you have to realize is during the war they gave up a lot of things, right? There was limits on gasoline, limits on tires, limits on sugar, on meat, etc. All to go to the war effort. And it also affected clothes, so that you were not supposed to buy new clothes. Your clothes should be streamlined, so you're using as little material as possible. The Zoot Suiters, one of the things they did was they made clothes with a lot of material. Huge collars, lots of flamboyant material, etc. And so Zoot Suit sort of became labeling to any of the youth that were kind of pushing back during that time. And so that's why it's called the Zoot Suit Riot. The LCI Students' Union requested in the 1940s permission to hold a snake dance to celebrate the election of their student council. A snake dance is a slightly disruptive event where you get a large number of people, they all hold hands, and will snake through an area. They could go through a business, they could cross a road, and basically it stops people from moving, and it's just a slightly disruptive activity. So they had to go to the place to get permission for a snake dance here down on 5th Street. They were given permission by Acting Chief Constable Sid Wallace, and all they were told is make sure you remain orderly. And in order to keep the snake dance orderly, what the LCI students did is they had a couple of people come along who weren't actually part of the dance to make sure everybody got safely across the streets, etc. The snake dancers were not the only ones down here that night though. Several other young men armed with lead pipes, knuckle dusters, heavy metal finger rings, and more attacked the group and primarily attacked the young men whose job it was to keep the rest orderly and safe. There were about 20 young men who attacked the 2 other young men. Fortunately, the police were able to move in quickly because the police were aware of the snake dance, etc. And the 2 young men did get injured, but not seriously because of the actions of the police that day. So we're looking across at the old Henderson Downer block. I won't go into details because I know I've talked about it on other tours, but of course that is the building where in 1907 on Christmas Day, Christmas Eve, we have the event with Harry Smith and the waiters that leads to the 1907 Christmas Day riot, where 500 people come down here to downtown Lethbridge, destroy that business, are looking to destroy other Chinese businesses, and it requires the mounted police and the city police to actually clean up the 1907 Christmas Day riot. A year prior, we were talking about the 1906 coal mine strike. So we're going to turn this way and look at this building. So I'm standing in front of the Dallas Hotel, Hotel Dallas, or the coal banks as you would know it today. This building has a connection to a Canadian Prime Minister and to the 1906 coal mine strike. During the early part of the 1900s, the miners were working really hard to get a union recognized, to get better working conditions, to get shorter working hours, and other grievances. The miners were demanding parity with the unionized miners in the Crow's Pass. They were looking for, as I said, increased pay, shorter hours, and a grievance procedure so that if there was disagreement between the miners and the bosses, there would be a procedure to follow. They also wanted recognition of the union. Mine management refused all of those and began firing any of the coal miners who were part of the union. So in March 1906, more than 500 miners from a couple of the mines around Lethbridge walked off the job and started a 9-month coal mine strike. The mines were able to reopen in May with 200 inexperienced scab mine workers working in the seams. And throughout the 1906 strike, there were violence and threats of violence, both perceived and real threats, throughout the entire time. And what the government did in response is 10% of the Royal Northwest Mounted Police Force across the entire country were either brought to Lethbridge or were on standby for Lethbridge during the strike. This is how seriously the violence or opportunity for violence was taken. And during the 9-month strike, we actually know there were 2 riots, a half dozen occasions of strike breakers and their families harassing, miners and their families harassing the strike breakers. There was at least 1 case of arson where the home of a strike breaker was set on fire. There were at least 13 explosions, and there were several cases of assault and charges of obstructing police officers during that time. I know on at least 1 occasion the police came down to arrest one of the strikers, and 300 men, women, children started pelting the police with rocks and cans, etc. during this time. Now that list may sound ominous, but actually during the 9-month strike there was little serious harmful violence, and that was because of the work of the miners to maintain order throughout the time. And the Mounties actually, one of the reasons they had 10% of the force on hand was because they may have been unduly concerned about the strike because they considered many of the miners foreigners, and that was a concern for them. This is a direct quote from that time. This is not my words. Foreign miners of Lethbridge were a troublesome, violent, treacherously drunken, uncivilized lot of brutes who lived in a piggish sort of way, and it could only be kept in line by use of force. So you can see why the miners and the police would have been having issues throughout that time. But as I said, it was not the police that kept it nonviolent, it was the strike organizers. They actually met with the police throughout the entire strike to ensure the safety of everyone involved. The strike ended in December 1906. Unfortunately, the miners received few of their concerns addressed during that time, and it would take other strikes and other protests by the miners to actually get the union recognized and to get many of their concerns addressed. Now, throughout all that, you might be wondering how any of this connects with the Hotel Dallas. The federal government became very concerned about this strike. Lethbridge was providing a lot of the coal to Saskatchewan, Alberta, and other parts of Western Canada that were actually used for home heating. We're heading into a winter. Saskatchewan is facing a coal famine, and they are thinking they're going to freeze in the winter. And so they sent the Deputy Minister of Labour, a man named William Lyon Mackenzie King, eventual Prime Minister of Canada, to Lethbridge to settle the strike. It is actually claimed that the strike was over before King got here, but like any good politician, he took credit for the whole thing anyways. And he actually stayed here in Lethbridge, and he stayed here at the Dallas. And it is said that while he was here in the Dallas Hotel, he actually sketched out the idea for the 1907 Industrial Disputes Investigation Act, the first labor act brought into Canadian history. And it forbade any strike or lockout until the matters in dispute had been dealt with by a board of conciliation and investigation. And so because of the Lethbridge strike, we see that law brought in. So not only did W.L. Mackenzie King sleep here, but he also started drafting some incredible legislation from this location. Protests that changed law. Good on you, miners. We're going to go down to the end of this street now. Whenever I pass the stores, I see all the things I want to buy. It's never good to get me in front of stores. Good thing it's Sunday and most aren't open. Or I'd be shopping.
And that could be a serious shopping with Belinda.
That'd be fun.
Yeah, and you could interview the business owners and tell them stories.
Absolutely. Well, here's what your building is.
Yeah.
I bought a bunch of Halloween candy at House Sweet,
Okay.
but I've had nieces and nephews open and it's all gone already. So I think I need to buy more. Should never buy Halloween candy too far in advance, right? All right, we're coming to the windiest corner in Lethbridge, so we're going to stop here in front of the Alec Arms and not actually go around the corner for a little bit. This next protest doesn't actually have a location attached to it, but it's such an adorably cute story that I have to tell it somewhere. It is my favorite protest in Lethbridge history. It is from 1972, and it is the Sesame Street protest. How can a Sesame Street protest not be adorable? We have a picture in the Herald from that time of a child that's maybe 2-3 years old holding a protest sign that says basically, don't take away my Sesame Street. I mean, it is the most adorable protest. In the fall of 1972, there were protests across Canada when some television stations decided to cancel Sesame Street. The argument being made by the television stations was that they were losing money by scheduling Sesame Street because it displaced high-revenue foreign content programs. The CRTC had brought in a new ruling that limited the amount of foreign content, and Sesame Street was now classified as foreign content. So stations, because they could only provide a certain amount of it, wanted to bring in better adult programming instead of the children's programming. Many people in Canada weren't actually affected by this decision, as they could still get Sesame Street from CBC. But Lethbridge and some other communities had no CBC station, so were in danger of losing Sesame Street. Families argued that Sesame Street was educational and that stations should be made to show that protests had to be made to show the stations the benefit of offering Sesame Street. There were, as I said, protests and petitions. In Lethbridge alone, 43% of all adults living in Lethbridge in 1972 signed the petition to save Sesame Street. I can't think of any other petition that has ever garnered that percent of the public. So again, another protest that absolutely worked. Sesame Street was brought back, and I don't know a kid in Lethbridge who probably didn't enjoy Sesame Street at some point. All right, we're going to go one block over to 6th Street and talk about another student protest. Teachers are going to hate me. Kids, you can protest. And do it effectively.
Yeah.
I don't know about you, but I think the media will come out whenever kids do a protest. Let's get across on the light here. Okay, I don't want to jinx us, but that wasn't that windy.
No, not at all.
Okay, here it comes.
Here it comes.
I did jinx us. But we're going to get up to 6th Street, so we'll stop there. Oh, I see the clothes I want. Let's keep walking quickly past the gorgeous clothes. Okay, that pink sweater's awesome.
It is. Has a little zipper pocket.
Yeah. Okay, since we're doing protests, can we all protest that every women's clothing should have pockets? Let's just get away from not having pockets on women's clothing once and for all.
And good sized pocket.
And good sized pockets you can actually carry things in. Yeah. Yeah, it's ridiculous. Okay, I have to pick the leaves from this review.
ASMR. Just sound effects for the walk.
I love the leaves. I don't like the raking of the leaves,
Yeah.
but I love the leaves. So I'm just going to mulch mine and leave them in the grass.
Mm-hmm.
All right, let's just duck around the corner here. So this corner here, 6th Street and 4th Avenue, was actually called Victory Square during the Second World War. So if you see pictures of Victory Loan parades or anything like that, this is often where they would come and where they would get together. At one time, of course, during the 1940s, the provincial courthouse would have been right across, and then just down from that would have been City Hall. So there was a very civic area, and this is where the demonstrations, the rallies, the parades all ended. So standing here in Victory Square, I decided to tell you some Hardyville stories, because of course I can't actually be in Hardyville on the tour. When Hardyville first developed as a community around 1909, it was actually set up so that its school was part of the Lethbridge School District. The province actually asked the Lethbridge School District in 1911 to take over Hardyville. Now you might wonder, why wasn't Hardyville permitted its own school district rather than having to be part of Lethbridge? It was actually because the province was worried about, as you might guess, foreign elements in the community of Hardyville. Anytime we look back at the history of Eastern Europeans, either the newspaper, the police, the province were concerned in those days. So originally 1911, it's formed as part of the Lethbridge School District. But very quickly, the residents of Hardyville did not feel that the Lethbridge School District took their concerns and needs seriously. In 1911, they built the original Hardyville School. And by 1920, there were already major concerns with that building. So in March 1920, the entire student body of Hardyville went on strike. Now, being coal miners' kids, they knew how to strike, and they all walked out of school and refused to go back. They refused to enter the school because they stated the school was in a disgraceful condition. The entire thing stemmed from a faulty heating and furnace system. The kids were suffering headaches and eye problems, the walls were covered with soot, and the heater was putting out smoke and dirt. So the Lethbridge School District was forced to react and use the Easter break of that 1920 year to entirely clean up the school, replace the fix the furnace, etc. But there were still problems between the parents and kids of Hardyville School and Lethbridge School District. One of their principals was fired, even though the parents didn't want him to be. Lots of issues were happening. So in 1920, Hardyville broke away from Lethbridge and created their own school district. That did not actually stop all the problems. In 1930, we get reports of kids in Hardyville choosing their own holidays, basically is how the newspaper reported it. The parents and the kids said the rich class had holidays, so should the poor, so should the working class. So on May 1st, International Workers' Day every year, most of the kids, many of the kids at Hardyville just wouldn't go to school because it should be a labor holiday, so they took it. And so there was lots of reports in the 1930s of Hardyville kids just not showing up May 1st because they were part of the working class. I kind of like that idea.
Yeah.
As I mentioned, courthouse was here, City Hall was one block over. A few people from some of these protests certainly would have been brought here to the courthouse and the police station. And such was the case in 1919 when there was, and this is how the newspaper reports it, a Donnybrook. We don't get to see that word enough in newspapers, but this was another fight between the police and striking miners. In the 1919 strike, miners, their wives and families waited at the train as the train came back from Hardyville into Lethbridge. When the train pulled into the 9th Avenue North stop, hundreds of miners and their families were waiting for the train to come back. The reason they were waiting is that there was, again, scab workers ununionized workers on that train who were keeping the mine working during the strike. So the miners and their families, the Alberta Provincial Police, and the Lethbridge Police Service were all waiting that day as the train came into town. As the train arrived, a rock was picked up and thrown at the window of the train. The police moved into the crowd to try to seize the rock thrower. Soon, as I said, at Donnybrook, a fight broke out with rocks, tin cans, and fists filling the air as 9 police officers faced off against the miners and their families, about 200 people in total. The police used their batons and even an axe handle to wade their way through the crowd to grab the person. In the end, the police were able to keep their prisoner and bring him here down to the police station downtown. The next day, another crowd, smaller than the first day, again greeted the train, so on that day, no fight broke out. As I said, it took years of fighting for the miners to be recognized, etc. These were but a few of the various episodes that have taken place in Lethbridge as protests, etc. Some of you, I'll just mention one last one as we mentioned, end up. In 1971, the Central School had closed and the city had taken it over. They had put in a drop-in center in there, and then they decided to close the drop-in center, and a protest occurred outside of Central School as they tried to keep their drop-in center. Of course, the center was closed, the school was knocked down. On and on, I could keep talking about more and more of them, but one of the things you can very easily see, some of the same issues keep coming up: labor, race relations, human rights, politics. All of the same issues over and over have played into our protests, and not surprisingly continue to play into the civil disobedience protests, demonstrations, parades of Lethbridge. It is a long history of civil disobedience in Lethbridge. I want to do more research on this. If you know of events I missed, or you can think of anything, please let me know. Again, ideas for next year, we'd be willing to hear them. What neighborhoods do we need to get out to? What events are we missing? What issues haven't we tackled yet? Contact us through the Lethbridge Historical Society, either our email or through this page. And this wraps up the last of our scheduled tours for 2021. See you all in 2022.